Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Sukkah Daf Yud Beis contains one Mishnah from the beginning of the Daf until the Mishnah is still in the middle of a search for the source of the halacha that tzchach has to be made from something which goes from the ground and does not mekabel tum. But the Gemara is going to bring two more sources, one of which will have a question and two answers on it. Then we get to the Mishnah, which discusses situations in which you can't make a sukkah because there are certain materials with which you cannot make a sukkah, to use those for tzchach because we're afraid of certain gzeros or possibly deraisas. The Gemara will discuss two situations. One is a deraisa, one's a derabanan. The Gemara is not sure which is which. The Gemara will try to figure out which one is which, and then the Gemara will discuss a number of similar situations and what their halachos are. So let's begin the Gemara. The Gemara is searching for the source that tzchach has to be made from something which has two factors. Number one, it goes from the ground. Number two, it's not mekabel tumah. The Gemara has already been through one source. The Gemara is now up to its next one. The Gemara says, when Ravan came, he said the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that the Torah, when it describes the mitzvah of sukkah, says you should make it when you're gathering from your grape fields, from your vineyards, and from your granaries. So you see, it has to be made from the leftover, from the psoles, from the garbage of your vines, of your vineyards, and your granaries, meaning from your wheat. So you have to obviously use thrown away branches of grapevines and thrown away stalks of grain, what was left over from the stalk after you took the grain off. And therefore it has to be those two things. It has to be something which grows from the ground like those, and something which is not mekabel tumah like those. So where it says, how do you know that it's referring to the garbage of the vineyard and of the granary? Maybe it's referring to the food of the vineyard and the granary. Maybe it's referring to the wine which you make from the vineyard, or the grapes, and it's also referring to the wheat which you harvest from the stalks. Now, you might not necessarily make a sukkah out of those, but those things are food, and food is mekabel tumah. So then I should be able to use something which is mekabel tumah, since the standard is these things. That's where we learn the halacha from. I should be allowed to use something which is mekabel tumah, just like these things which are food are mekabel tumah. So we're assuming that it's referring to the garbage, the stalks and the branches. But how do you know? Maybe it's referring to the food. So the Gemara says, well, when it says the yakev, the vineyard, what food could it be referring to? Yakev doesn't mean grapes. Yakev means wine. So it would have to be referring to the wine. You can't possibly make tzchach out of wine. Wine's a liquid. It doesn't form a roof material, and therefore it has to be referring to the branches. Where it says, who told you? Maybe it's referring to wine, which comes from the area of the Sneer, the river of Sneer. And over there, the wine, when it congeals, it forms a thick cake, like a pressed cake of figs stuck together, and you could use it for tzchach. So Gemara comments, that was said by Rabbi Yirmiyah. The Gemara says that Rav Zera said, we almost had this halacha figured out until Rabbi Yirmiyah came along, and he messed it up for us. Now we don't have a source for this halacha. So Gemara says, first of all, I'm going to rescue this, and then I'm going to give you another source. The rescue for this is that the Torah says, mi garnecha and mi yikvecha, from your granary and from your vineyard, not your yakev and your grain itself, not the wine and the grain itself, something that comes from it. What comes from it? The garbage, the branches, and the husks of the straw from the stalks itself. That's saving that. Now, another source is a pasuk in Nehemiah describing the making of the sukkah, and he says, "Tzu'u hargara, to the mountains, ve'aviyu ali zayis, leaves of an olive tree, ali eitz shemen, leaves of a tree that produces oil, ali hadas, ali tamarim, leaves of a hadas tree, leaves of a date tree, and ali eitz avos, leaves of the eitz avos tree." So the Gemara says eitz avos is hadas. So, first of all, this is a good source, because it clearly says you have to use branches, and that's something which goes from the ground and is mekabel, and is not mekabel tumah. But the Gemara is wondering what's the difference between ali hadas and ali eitz avos. Eitz avos and hadas are the same thing. When the Torah identifies the hadas that used for the four minim, it calls it anaf eitz avos. The Gemara says, you're right. Hadas here refers to a pasal hadas, a hadas shoto, where the leaves aren't all growing from the same level. Each set of three leaves isn't growing from the same spot on the stem. That's puzzle to be used as a hadas for the lulav, for the four minim, but it's kosher to be used as tzchach. When it says eitz avos, that's referring to where it's growing properly, and then you can use that for the four minim. Okay, now we get to the Mishnah. Mishnah discusses where you have a bundle of material. So it says a bundle of straw, a bundle of branches, and a bundle of reeds. These things, you cannot use them for tzchach. If you untie them, then you can use them. But all these things that were listed in all these mishayos you can't use for tzchach, you could use for the walls of the sukkah. So the Gemara now says, Rav Yaakov says that I heard from Rav Yechanan two halachas, and I heard two sources, and I don't remember which one. I heard two explanations for two halachas. We've seen in Mishnayos of things you're not allowed to use for sukkah. I don't remember which one was the explanation for which. One is this Mishnah which says you can't use bundles, and the other is the halacha that you can't make a sukkah by hollowing out a haystack. If you have a huge mountain of hay, you cannot dig out some hay, and you end up with 4 walls on a roof or 3 walls on a roof. You cannot make a sukkah by hollowing out a space within a haystack. And the two reasons he said was, one was Gzeras Oitzer. Gzeras Oitzer means we're afraid that you may make this structure in a way which is not kosher for sukkah. Like, for example, you make it for storage. You make a roof for something else as a storage house, and you do not intend to use it for shade, and you do not intend to use it for the mitzvah of sukkah, and therefore it's possible for sukkah. And you're gonna, or some other way in which you may make it, which is possible for sukkah, and then you'll just decide to turn it into a sukkah without redoing the schach, and that would be a possible sukkah. You didn't make it properly, and now you're deciding to use it for your sukkah. Therefore, we tell you you can't lechatchila make a sukkah's mitzvah out of that material. That way, if you want to use it for a sukkah, you will never get yourself into a situation where it'll be possible and you'll end up using it for a sukkah, because you can't make a sukkah like that in the first place. So that could be either of these two. That could be that you cannot use bundles of branches, because bundles of branches you may put on your roof or the roof of your storehouse or something to dry out and harden. And leaving it there for that purpose, you may decide on the few days before sukkahs, hey, look, I have a sukkah there already, and you'll end up using it, and that's possible sukkah because you didn't put it there for sukkahs or for shade. So since that would be a problem, therefore the Chazal said you cannot make a sukkah out of tied bundles of branches at all. Now, if they're spread out, that's not a problem because nobody spreads them out to dry. When you spread them out, you just heave the bundle up on the roof. So you spread them out, that would be okay. Now, the haystack could be the same thing. Haystack, it could also be where it was not made for a sukkah. It was just made as a haystack, and that will be a psul as well. Now, the other explanation, so this is all Gzeras Oitzer. The other explanation that Rav Yaakov says he heard from Rav Yechanan is Tasav Eloi Min Ha'asoi. It's a psul de'oraisa, that you made this thing in the wrong way. That means, again, Tasav Eloi Min Ha'asoi we've had in the past, you took a sukkah which already exists, and you turned a pasul sukkah, which is already built, into a kosher sukkah by being machshir something. But you never built a new sukkah in a kosher way. You didn't make the sukkah in a kosher way. That's a psul. Daraisa, you have to build it kosher. You cannot take a built one and turn it from kosher to pasul. That stays pasul forever. It has to be first made kosher and then built, constructed. So he said, I don't know which one is which. I don't know which is the problem. Which is the explanation for the reason that you can't use branches to put on a sukkah, where you can't use bundled up branches, straw, or reeds, and which is the explanation why you can't hollow out a haystack. So the Gemara says, okay, let's investigate. We have a quote of Rav Yochanan where he clearly says the reason you cannot use straw, bundles of straw, branches, or reeds is because people sometimes come in from the field and they put it on the roof of their storehouse to dry out, and then they decide to use it for sukkah. And that's a problem because they didn't make it for sukkah. And the Torah said you got to make it correctly. You cannot make it and then later decide you want to use it. You can't make it for something else and then later decide, I want to use that for a sukkah now. It has to be built for the right reason, either for sukkah or for a shade. So Gemara says, so since he clearly says that the reason for our Mishnah here, which is the bundles of the branches, is that it's a psul d'oraisa, it's a psul d'Rabbanan, because we're afraid that you may end up building it in a pasul way, you putting the branches on the roof to dry out and then decide to use it for sukkah. So clearly the problem with the haystack then is the other explanation that it's tasav loy min ha'asoi. You're making a sukkah that already exists into a kosher sukkah by hollowing out the space underneath it. And Gemara just says, why didn't Rav Yaakov know this? Rav Yaakov didn't hear this other quote of Rav Yechon, and therefore he didn't say which one is which. Now, the Gemara here asks, because this is strange over here, because both reasons really apply to both situations. Both situations, if you make it in the pasul way, it's pasul d'oraisa. And there's a kosher way to do it, which the Rabbanan could have said, we're making a gzera, don't do it that way, lest you make it the pasul way. Like, to put branches on a sukkah to dry out, and then decide, I want to use this now for sukkah, that's tasav lo min ha'asoi. That's doing it the wrong way. That you want to use an already built sukkah as a sukkah. The Torah didn't say that. The Torah said, make a sukkah. That's, if you do it that way, it's pasul d'oraisa. And Chazal could have said, don't do it that way, because you'll end up, you can't make a sukkah out of bundles of branches in the first place, because lest you may end up doing the rest. Now the haystack could be the same thing. You could take the haystack, you could hollow it out and take off the roof and then put hay back on top, and that would be a kosher sukkah. Or you could do it the wrong way. You could just hollow it out and leave the roof, and that would be a pasul sukkah. And Chazal could say, don't make it by putting hay on top of a haystack where you hollow it out all the way up to the sky, because that could be you could end up doing it the wrong way, and therefore don't do it that way, even if you do it in the kosher way. So both could work for both. So the kasha is on Rav Yaakov quoting Rav Yochanan. How does Rav Yochanan know that the Mishnah that talks about the haystack, that's talking about where you did it that way, you did it the way which is pasul, where you just hollowed it out and you left the roof and it's a psul d'oraisa. And this Mishnah here is talking about where you did it l'chadchila correctly, but it's usher. Derabanan gzeira atu, you may do it the wrong way. I know which one. How does he know? One's talking about where you did it the right way, but it's pasul midrabanan. The other was talking about we did it the wrong way, and it's pasul d'oraisa. So the Gemara says it's from the language of the Mishnah. That's the answer. This one here says, you should not make a sukkah out of these. It means it's telling you, even though there's a right way to do it, don't do it. So the Banan coming to tell you that even though you could do it in a way which is kosher d'oraisa, that's if you spread it properly on the sukkah, l'shem sukkah, don't do it, because you get mixed up. You'll end up in a situation where you'll come to be over the d'oraisa. Now about the haystack, it doesn't say that. About the haystack, it says a sukkah which is made out of a haystack is pasul. Obviously, that's talking about a situation where you made it the wrong way. It's not talking about a situation where there's a gzeira, that it's usher because you may come to make it the wrong way. It's referring to the situation in which you went ahead and you made it wrongly, and that's therefore why he learns that psul that way. That's why he understands that Mishnah that way. He understands this Mishnah as talking about the iser d'Rabbanan, but that's talking about the iser d'oraisa. Okay, now the Gemara talks about a number of different materials that are pasul to use for sukkah. Rav Yehuda, in the name of Rav, talks about if you make a sukkah out of the shafts of arrows. The way they used to make arrows was they would make the shaft separately, and then they would attach the arrowhead. And now there are two ways to do that. The arrowhead could have a hollow in it, and that you stuck the shaft into. Or the shaft could have a hollow in the end, and the arrowhead had a peg, and you inserted that into the shaft. Meaning one could be the male end, one could be the female end. And that's what the Gemara actually refers to it as the zachar and then the keva end. Now the halacha with wood is that if it's flat and has no hollowness, has no place that's makabel, just pure straight, then it's not makabel tumah. So the Gemara therefore quotes, here says the name of Rav, that if the shaft has no hole in it, the shaft is the male end, then it is kosher, because it's not makabel tumah. It's a straight kli made out of wood. However, if it's the female end that it has the hollowed out part, then it is pasul, because it is makabel tumah. So the Gemara says both of these are pashut. So the Gemara says if it's kosher, when it's the non-hollowed out part, when it's the peg part, the chiddush there is that you don't make a gzeira out to a situation where it's pasul because it's the hollowed out part. And in the place of the hollowed out part, there's a chiddush because you may think that since it's meant to be permanently filled with the arrowhead and never used to be left open, it's not meant to be a kli, it just meant it's made hollow as part of its construction. You may think therefore it doesn't count as a hollow, doesn't count as a kli kibul, and the chiddush is to tell you that it does count as a kli kibul. Okay, now the Gemara discusses combed out flax. Now the way flax was made was there were 3 steps in the process. Flax is fibers that grow in a stalk. So first you have to soak the stalks in water to soften them. Then you have to beat them to break them open, to break open the kernels, the ball that the fibers are in, and then you have to comb them out. Once they're combed out, you pretty much have tongues of combed flax. Then you could use that. We already know that that's makabel tumah at that stage, because it's already metame. If it gets tzaras on it, it's already makabel tumah negoyim. So Gemara says that Rav Yochanan has said that if it's in the state called anitze pishton, that's where it's already combed out, then it's possible to use for sukkah because it's already makabel tumah. If it's before all 3 steps, it hasn't even been soaked yet, then it's definitely kosher, and that is what the Gemara calls hutzni pishton. Now, Rabbi Bar Chana said over Rav Yochanan that Hushni, Rav Yochanan is not sure. So the Gemara says Rav Yochanan wasn't sure about Hushni, these two the middle stage in flax production. He said he's not sure if that's makabel tumah or not, and if he's not sure if it's kosher v'schach or not. And said Rabbi Bar Chana, I'm not sure which stage is this middle stage. What is he referring to? Is he referring to after it was soaked? After step 1 was already performed, but before step 2, before it was already beaten? Or is he referring also to after step 1 and 2, but before step 3? I'm not sure which of those other stages are called Hutzni. Now the Gemara brings a few more examples. The Gemara says that Rav Yehuda said that Shushi and Shvitzri are two plants. Rashi defines they grow in the forest. They have wide leaves. He says you're allowed to use them both for schach. And Abaye says you're allowed to use Shushi and not allowed to use Shvitzri because they smell. And therefore people aren't going to be able to stand it and they'll run out of the sukkah. Rav Chanan Bar Rava says that Hizmi and Higi, two types of thorny plants you're allowed to use for schach, and Abaye said you could use Hizmi, but you cannot use Higi because leaves drop off it and it's going to flow in your soup, and therefore people are going to run out of the sukkah.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethe.daf@gmail.com.